Hello, we're going to be talking about what phonetics and phonology are in this lecture and just introducing these concepts, although it is hard to talk about them without all of the knowledge you're going to be getting over the semester, but we'll be coming back to these concepts over and over throughout the course and reinforcing them. So while they may seem a bit strange now, by the end of the semester, you should have a good feeling for what terms like phonetics means as opposed to phonology. And this is important because you should never confuse these two things, although unfortunately, speech pathologists often do. I've overheard people using these terms incorrectly, and it sort of calls into question your skills and knowledge in these areas. And these areas are really important to what speech pathologists do. It is the bulk of what they do. Most speech pathologists work in schools, and most of them work on children with speech sound disorders. And that's what these two terms relate to. So it's very important to know what they are. So I'm going to start out briefly talking about what phonetics is and what exactly that means. Now, really, in the most generic terms, phonetics is just the scientific study of the production, transmission, and reception of speech sounds. All right, put more briefly, phonetics is just the study of speech sounds. We're just trying to describe what they are, how they are produced, how it is that people hear them. For example, you might have heard things like about dog whistles, things that make sounds that we don't hear. Yet all speech sounds that we need to hear, we can, unless you have something like a hearing problem, and then you have another issue altogether. But for example, you have to know phonetics if you're going to be an audiologist, because you have to know about how the human ear reacts to different types of sounds, including speech sounds. All right, so that's all of what goes into phonetics. It's a science, so it's a scientific study, and it looks at three different aspects of speech sounds: how they're produced, how they're transmitted, and that's through sound waves in the air, a whole subject of another class that you'll have with me, and how they're received, how we hear these sounds. All right, so speech sounds are the basic unit of study in phonetics, and sometimes people call speech sounds phones. That other term you'll see there on the screen. They're pretty much interchangeable. So a phone is just any speech sound that can occur in any type of natural language. All the languages of the world have various speech sounds, and as you'll find out pretty soon in this class, they don't all share the same speech sounds. There's some languages that use sounds that we don't use, and to us it sounds really exotic. And English has sounds that other languages do not use and are exotic and difficult if somebody, let's say, were to learn English later on in life. So we're going to use this definition of phonetics to understand the different branches. There's different types of people who perform phonetics or study phonetics are phoneticians, and so there's different types of phoneticians. Hold me a moment while I get out my pen here so we can follow along as I talk about each one. All right, so the first type of phonetics is articulatory phonetics. And that is the focus of this class. This is what you're basically doing. All right, so endure with my awful writing here with my mouse. My tablet isn't working this class. I'm trying to dot the explanation point here, but it won't let me. All right, so we're talking about articulatory phonetics, and you're going to hear me use the term articulation quite a bit. And that's just how speech sounds are produced. All right, so how you have to move your tongue, shape your lips, or whatever is needed to produce a sound. Articulatory phonetics is just the study of how each sound is produced. All right, so the second one is acoustic phonetics, and that has to relate to the transmission part of the definition I gave you earlier of phonetics. How sound is transmitted, how does it travel through the air? This involves the physics of sounds, and this is something that you just basically know that it's a study of transmission, speech sounds, and something that you'll learn about what it means in more detail next semester. And finally, auditory perceptual phonetics, which you probably can guess without my definition. It's just the study of the reception of speech sounds. This is the branch of phonetics that is closely related to audiology. So we need to know what frequencies are involved in speech sounds and how to design hearing aids to better capture frequencies that somebody might not be able to hear so they can hear speech properly. All of that has to do with knowing how the ear responds to the speech sounds and the sounds traveling through the air. Okay, so those are our speech, our various, excuse my pause here while I get rid of all this stuff on the screen. Those are our various branches of phonetics, and unfortunately that usually does not include our main interest here, or maybe your main interest if your goal is to become a speech pathologist. And that would be to become somebody who is proficient in clinical phonetics. And clinical phonetics can just be defined as being able to describe the sounds produced by speech disordered clients in the clinic. So describing sounds that are not exactly the way they should be when somebody makes a mistake with a speech sound. And that's a little different from articulatory phonetics, as we talked about, since there is some assumption here that you're studying natural, so-called normal language. And clinical phonetics includes the knowledge of normal phonetics, or how normal speech sounds are produced, but also disordered speech sounds. Sounds that are not quite right and need treatment. And there are two types of investigation for clinical phonetics, or actually any type of investigation or any type of phonetics, whether you're looking at normal or disordered sounds. But there's two main ways to go about investigating sounds. And the main one, and what we're mostly using in this class, is, I'll stick with my color purple here, is our impressionistic. So just listening, just using your ear. If you will be patient with my really bad drawing of an ear, and using your ear and writing down what you hear. So this is my representation of a pencil, if you buy that. All right, so just listening and writing down, and this is what we're mainly doing in this course, is studying a special system of writing down what you hear so that everyone understands. You might have your own way of sort of sounding out what you're hearing and using your knowledge of the English alphabet, but that's not very effective at conveying what you hear for reasons we'll get into pretty soon. So we have a special system of transcription, and that type of recording of disordered or normal speech sounds is called impressionistic. The second type is more of the subject of speech science next semester, where we use instruments to investigate different types of speech sounds. whether you record it and you analyze the sound using a computer program, or perhaps you use something like ultrasound, which isn't just for babies and measuring how far they are or looking at them at certain points throughout the pregnancy. Ultrasound can actually be used if you put a type of transponder under the chin and use that to look at the tongue. You can actually use ultrasound waves to see what type of tongue positions and shapes are used when people talk. So there's a whole lot of instruments that people use when they are doing phonetics, more than we can talk about right now. But I just gave you a few examples for you to think about. So you can record sound waves or use things like ultrasound to as part of your investigation of speech sounds. All right. We'll get rid of our ear and pencil here. So those are the basics of phonetics. Now we have to change tracks a bit and talk about phonology. But first, let's talk about this first term here, linguistics. And linguistics is something you might have a feeling of what it means, but at this point, I just want you to think of it as the study of language in general, including speech. Now, speech pathologists sometimes differentiate between speech and language, but we'll just use linguistics as the study of however people communicate, whether they're talking, using sign language, using a computer to talk for them because they've lost their voice. Linguistics is a study of all of that. And linguistics has lots of different fields of study, including phonetics, which we've just talked about, and also phonology, which is closely related to phonetics, but not exactly the same thing. I'm going to give you a very simple definition right now, and we're going to work on reinforcing that later on in the course. But while you're studying phonetics and looking at speech sounds, phonology is looking at the organization of those speech sounds. All right, phonology does not talk about how those sounds are produced like phonetics does. It looks at, let's say, where sounds are allowed to occur within a word. You know, what patterns happen. And a few more examples might help. But remember those keywords, patterns and organization, when you think of phonology. All right, so part of phonology is deciding what speech sounds within a language are what we call phonemes. All right, and I'm going to highlight this word because all of these words are going to be very unfamiliar for you, so you know which word I'm talking about on the page. So right now we're talking about this one I just highlighted in blue, a phoneme. And a phoneme is what we call smallest linguistic unit. And hint, when I slow down my pace a lot, you might want to be writing this down. Smallest linguistic unit capable of changing the meaning of a word. All right, so we can have lots of speech sounds, maybe even some we're not meaning to produce, like when we have a slip of the tongue and we're like, bleh, or we make some other sound to indicate like, okay, I just goofed up what I was saying there, and you know, we're not really starting a new word per se. Or you accidentally whistle while you're talking if you've lost some teeth. You know, there's all sorts of sounds you can produce while you're talking. A phoneme is a very special one that you can use to differentiate words. And the way you find out whether a sound is a phoneme is whether you can find a minimal pair here. I'm switching to green now. And so let's think of the words chip. It doesn't want to let me dot my I's ever. And well, I'll use the same color here, green, because these are each together, they make up a minimal pair. And if you look at these words, you'll notice that they both have this ip sound at the end, and it's only the beginning that changes. All right, and I think I was using this blue before. So these are our phonemes. We have a ch in chip, and we have a sh in ship. That's the only thing that makes those two words different. Otherwise, they're the same. They both have this ip part. It's just in ship, we have sh, or what we write as this symbol. And in chip, we have a sound that we write like this, a ch. And so we know that in English, ch and sh are not, they're actually kind of close, but they're not exactly the same sound. And if you switch it out at the beginning of the word, you might get a totally different word. And that is what we will call then a phoneme. All right, so I'm just going to erase here before I go on to the next slide. Now, in contrast to a phoneme, sometimes you have speech sounds that are, all sort of like the same sound. Like you might have a T that is like I just said there, T, or a T, something with a really breathy sound after it, or you might just say a word like bat, and you didn't hear me say bat, for example. Those two T's, as I said them, at the end of the word were both T-like, but they sounded kind of different. Bat versus bat. Right? And the easiest way to think about this is to use sort of analogy from something else. Now, on this picture, on these pictures here, I all have the same guy. Maybe you saw him in a movie this summer. He's kind of gotten to be a big star lately. And these are all Chris Pratt, if you aren't for some reason familiar with this actor. Right? But yet they're all different pictures. Here's Chris Pratt in Jurassic Park, I presume. I didn't get to see it this summer, unfortunately. And here's Chris Pratt here in Parks and Rec. Two different looking Chris Pratts. This is the, workout, totally buff Chris Pratt, and this is him in his more doughy days. This is a drawing of Chris Pratt, slightly different. It's not a picture. This is like some sort of pencil drawing. Yet we still know that that's Chris Pratt. There's some essence of Chris Pratt there, even though visually all these three images I've talked about are very different from each other. They're just all slight variations. Or finally, my favorite, Chris Pratt dressed up as Princess Leia in a Saturday Night Live sketch. Even wearing a costume and dressing up as a female, when you look at that face, still somehow we know that that's Chris Pratt. That's our visual system telling us that, okay, even though this person that is either in a picture or a drawing looks slightly different in all of these pictures, we all know it's the same person. So in analogy, an allophone is some sort of sound that is slightly different, but we all know that it's basically like the same sound. So it's like looking at different pictures and recognizing even though there's little variations, it's all basically the same thing. Right, so even though we have different pictures here, it's not enough to change something completely, like our minimal pairs makes a totally different word. Whereas, and that is something with a phoneme. All right, so a phoneme will make a completely different word. Whereas if you were looking at an allophone, and I said like the sound t as in bat, slightly different, you would still understand the concept of bat. Even if I pronounced that T a little bit differently, you'd still hear the sounds that connect together to make the word that you understand to be that creature that flies around at night and is supposed to turn into a vampire if you're into vampire literature or horror novels or what have you. So that's what makes a difference between a phoneme and an allophone. And once we've covered more speech sounds, we're going to go over lots more examples to help you reinforce that concept and really understand it. So we're going to be going back to this over and over again. Next, another important aspect of phonology, besides looking for minimal pairs, deciding what the phonemes are in a language and what are allophones in a language, phonology also looks at phonotactics. And phonotactics, get ready to jot this down if you want, is simply the description of where sounds are found in a language. Like, are they found only at the beginning of the word, the end of a word, in the middle of a word, all of the above, only one of those choices, and where they cannot occur. Now, that's something you probably have never really thought about too much, but it can be really important. And there's a lot of weird things that we do in English that you probably haven't consciously thought of. All right, so there's a lot of letters that we might have at the beginning of a word, like the letter F here. I'm going to turn on my highlighter again. All right, so we've got things like flight and fright. You have these things called clusters, these combinations of sounds at the beginning. You can have fla, fra, lots of different things that come together. All right, but are there any other ones you can think of? How about this letter or this sound? Can you call something a phtite? Does that work? In English, that absolutely does not work. It sounds really weird. If I say phtite, trying to think of what other vowel I can, phtot, it sounds weird. We can't even imagine an imaginary word being invented that has that sound combination. It just sounds awkward to English speakers. So there is absolutely no FT at the beginning of a word. What about at the end? Can you think of a word? Give yourself a second here before I give you the answer. Of a word where you combine those two, a f and a t sound. You think of it now? As weird as it sounds to us to have a ft at the beginning of a word, we do that at the end of the word. So we have words like left, left. So we're actually saying both of those sounds, and it's perfectly allowable at the end of the word, but not at the beginning of the word. And that's something uniquely English and can vary language to language. If you've ever studied a foreign language, there may have been certain sounds or combination of sounds that you've been asked to master so that you can pronounce the language correctly, but are kind of awkward because they go against what you're used to using in English. And that's all due to that language's phonotactic system. All right, so we're going to end our discussion here after I erase my examples by a quick reminder to remember these terms. Now, when you do your warm-up for this lecture, please let me know. I'm going to give you a few exercises to help you test out how comfortable you feel with them and let me know what you need more coverage of, because these are important terms. And it's not only this course where you'll need to understand the difference between a phoneme and an allophone, but future courses you'll need it in grad school when you start talking about treatment. So it's very important, and I want to help you understand these terms as much as possible, as early as possible. All right, so I'm just reiterating how important they are. And here are a few things for you to think about. You can pause the video and maybe jot down a few notes that we can discuss together in class. So there's a few things to get you thinking about sounds, not as letters, but as speech sounds, as phones, as a phonetician would. So there's lots of different quirks in English spelling, and one of these is the fact that one letter in English may not resemble or represent one speech sound. It might resemble what we might call two speech sounds, or we might call them different things, or actually a whole group of letters might only represent one sound. So English does a lot of weird things with its spelling system, and that's why it's a good idea not to use it when you're transcribing or impressionistically writing down what you're hearing, if you're reporting what your client is producing in terms of disordered speech sounds, or just any type of phonetic investigation, because English spelling is so unreliable. So think of these following words and whether you think there are one or two sounds represented by each letter I have written down here. You might have to say them to yourself and think about it. Think about patio, hurt, pack, neighbor, box, steps, and report back to class with what you found. After that, you might want to think about something a little bit more challenging, starting at the word level. How many sounds do you think each of these words has? It's not as simple as counting letters. I can guarantee you that not many of these will actually have the same amount of sounds as there are letters. And from here, we're obviously working up to how you transcribe these sounds using something besides the English alphabet. But first, we have to be able to hear how many different sounds are so that you can then write them down correctly. So take a shot thinking about how many different sounds you hear in each of these words, and we can go over this in class. So good luck with your warm-up, and let me know what you may feel uncertain about after listening to this lecture and your reading.